evening, everyone, and welcome to Let's Get Real. It's been quite a while. Sorry for all the jerking you guys around from week to week and not knowing what the hell is happening. But finally, we're back, and I'm very excited about the talk tonight because it's quite a controversial one, but I think it's also a very important one to have. And so joining me tonight is Carter van Jaarsveld, or the person behind White Noise Podcast. Welcome, Carter.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to tell you, Dioné, not all jerks are bad in this life. So when you jerk people around, it's not always bad.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. In this regard, I actually did feel bad, though. I'm sorry, guys. But thank you so much for joining me tonight. So the reason why I wanted to firstly have this conversation is because I think that people always enter this debate from the perspective of the abortion debate. And so when you are already pregnant, should you have the kid or should you not have the kid? And I think the more interesting question is, well, maybe we shouldn't let it get to that point at all. Because given the fact that we're rational creatures, presumably we do have ways of preventing it from getting to a stage where you even have to make that decision. Of course, there are times when you can't prevent it, but I'm not talking about cases like that. In a lot of cases, you can. And so I thought it would be more interesting to consider what would be moral reasons for and against having kids, because I don't think this topic is often discussed. I think it's sort of taken for granted that it's a good thing to have children. But I think that as the political tensions have risen, this has no longer been the case for various reasons. I think it's actually become quite a politicized topic. So the reason why I wanted Carter on is because I also wanted someone who is also doesn't fall into a very specific political box, who's also a man, so can come at it from a very different perspective. And presumably can also conduct a rational conversation around this topic, which not a lot of people can. So thank you so much for joining me. Can you just give me a bit of background on who you are, where you come from, how you got into the space, all of that fun stuff?
I'll keep it very, very brief. You can go check me out at White Noise Podcast. I started a podcast mid-COVID, focusing more on resilience. And since then, I wanted to focus a bit on the battle of ideas. And since then, I've realized I'll still be part of that. But predominantly, I want to teach people how to build resilience, both mentally, spiritually, and then also physically. Like, what can you do in your life to embody the virtues, especially pulling from inspiration from the ancient philosophers, the Stoics, and anyone else that has information or good philosophies about building resilience, and then actually embodying that resilience and building it into my life, becoming more self-sufficient, getting off state utilities, growing my own food, and all these kind of fun stuff, and getting off the grid. And those that's the kind of content I create. And then with tonight's topic, I think it's a very relevant one, right? Because traditionally the nuclear family was kind of the pro-conservatism standpoint, but things have changed drastically. And there's a lot of interesting ways people are interpreting this. So thank you for inviting me. Happy to be on your show, Dioné.
Great. Okay, so let's jump right in because there's a lot to get through and we don't have that much time. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I think most people, I mean, just from my day-to-day interactions with people, the question most people ask you is, if you say that you don't want to have kids, you know, they tend to be quite surprised and they say, oh, well, why don't you want to have kids? As if that's the thing that requires justification. But in my opinion, what requires justification is with why do you want to have children? Because in that case, you're actually choosing to bring a sentient being into the world, a being that will be susceptible to a lot of pain, suffering, and heartache. And you know this for a fact because you know there's no way they can avoid that. So you're choosing to bring this person into the world against their will. They have no say in the matter. And presumably you should have good reasons for why you're doing this. And so it's very odd to me that it's sort of taken for granted that, you know, having kids is just something that you ought to do and you shouldn't have to justify, whereas not having kids is something you should justify.
It's frightening for me how many people fucking wing having kids. I'm just going to come out of the gate and say that. They just wing it. They don't budget for them. They don't plan for it. They just wing it. And I mean, for some people that they can do it that way, but not everyone can do that.
Yeah.
It's a very daunting thing. There's a lot of things to consider, as you mentioned, and hopefully we'll get through them all within this hour tonight.
Yeah, so in the spirit of full disclosure, I'm going to be very honest here. I don't want to have children.
Neither do I.
That and that's just I've just felt that way for most of my life. Probably the only time at which I ever wanted kids was when I was a small child. Then as I grew up, I was like this, and that desire has never kicked in. There's never been a point at which I've ever gone, yes, this is something I want.
I changed the nappy once, and that was it for me. I'm joking. No, it's more than that. I actually take the burden very seriously of having kids.
Yeah.
So do I with pets.
Yes.
I travel a lot, and if I feel I neglect my pets, I would rather not have any, because I feel it's not right towards the animal. So I feel that 10 times more for children. Like if you don't give it your all, you shouldn't have them. So that's kind of a bit of my perspective there.
Yeah, but of course, I have people in my life who have had children, and I can also see, the joy that it brings them.
Right.
So I'm not oblivious to that, but I think that still the point of tonight's conversation is to consider reasons for and against. So we're going to try and be measured in this, even though both of us already have our own views on the matter. So let's start off with reasons for having kids. Let's just start there. So I think that the issue has become quite politicized because, as you mentioned, it's traditionally been the case that if you're right-leaning in your political views, that you are going to tend to view having children positively. And a big part of why that would be the case is because you think that having children is a part of sustaining and perpetuating the nuclear family, which is that immediate family structure of two parents who are married and they have their set of children. And so it's this idea of the immediate family structure. And there's a lot of research to show that family structure creates a lot of stability in society. It also creates a very strong sense of belonging and connectedness. So psychologically, it's very beneficial to people who come from the nuclear family, where the nuclear family has actually managed to put that structure together in a constructive way rather than a destructive way. So obviously we're not denying that there are cases where parents stay married, but their marriage is a disaster and ultimately it's more destructive to the children that they stay married. Even though those cases exist, overall, it still has the evidence still shows that it is good that you have this nuclear family structure. And obviously the right also has their reasons for supporting that nuclear family structure, and that also has to do with their feelings around the state and the state having reach in other ways, where if you have a family, you determine what the values are. You basically are the source of support. The state is not considered to be essentially the other parent and the overarching force that influences your children, because the nuclear family plays that very important part of influencing them. So I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that point for now, Carter.
Now, as you mentioned before we started, there's a lot of people pushing back and saying this is very unbalanced. Like, we go into this, and we actually mentioned it before we started, because we did acknowledge that might be the case, and that's fine. And like I mentioned, we don't have all the answers. And I think going into parenthood, I'm not saying like, you're 100% right in the theory. You cannot plan for everything. But what I'm saying is people need to just take it seriously when they do have to have kids. They just can't go in trying to wing it. So I take it very seriously when people do want to have kids. Of course, you cannot plan for anything and everything. There's a ton of variables, with children. And all I'm saying is take the responsibility of having kids very seriously and go in at 100%. This is not something you can half-ass. This is not drinks with friends or buying a new car or a house. This is ultimately something that you do want to do well, because the consequences of not being a good parent, regardless of what your parenting style is dire. That means you end up with a crackhead Antifa kind of kid, or it means you have a successful kind of functional child that goes into the world and makes waves and successful. and you have a fruitful life with them, and you have grandchildren. But the opposite can also happen where they stay in your basement. So 100% taking that your critique to heart. And that's why we obviously have the comment section open for a bit more balance in tonight's conversation.
Well, yeah, so I mean, to address the comment off the bat, I did consider the fact that, yeah, I should have a parent on the stream. But at the end of the day, I will mention comments from people that I know that in my personal life that have children. So it's not in any way supposed to be just against.
This is not an
having kids.
anti-children discussion.
No,
I said,
no.
don't take it personally. I mean, I love kids. My brother and sister have kids. Other people's kids get well with them swimmingly. We're talking more about the responsibility that goes with it.
And also, again, for and against, we're just starting with, we actually were starting with for having kids. So it's weird to me that the commentary has already gone to, we've just made that choice. But I'm not in any way saying people shouldn't have kids. I'm saying that's just not something
You're not anti-natalist.
No, I'm not anti-natalist, in fact. But we'll get to that. So the one reason I wanted to talk about where I think that the right has kind of promoted having children, and I can see why that's the case, and this is this point about the importance of maintaining the nuclear family. And I think that's a very good point, that you should have children because it's maintaining a structure in society that in a very real way means that we're not dependent on the state for a lot of so for example, when it comes to welfare, if we have nuclear families that are strong, so we have 2-parent households where there are children, and that structure is stable and it's a strong one, it presumably would limit the number of people who are dependent on the welfare state. And that could only be a good thing because it's not draining resources and it's not developing this massive dependency on the state. So that for me is a very good way of thinking about the future and safeguarding a specific way of life that doesn't become infiltrated by statist oversight. But then I also think to myself, well, but the world, so one of the criticisms of the right is that, well, their worldview is very conservative, as in they think about conserving traditional values and how that should be done. But the world no longer looks the way that it used to look. Like you've just mentioned, in terms of expenses. So if we think of this country, for example, you can't just send your children to any old school, because even the government schools, I mean, I went to a government school, and even in my day, government schools, which is what my parents could afford, they couldn't afford a private school. But government schools were still considered to be good enough. Like if you found the right school, you could still get a decent education. Now the feeling has shifted completely, and parents in general. So my sister has a daughter, and the feeling has also shifted that, look, that's just not feasible anymore. You can't just send your child to any school, especially not a government school, because the education is so poor. So if you want your child to have a future, you actually do have to send them, probably, unless you found and they still are, like there are some government schools still that are really good. I've heard this, so I'm not like saying there are no good government schools, but there's few and far between at this point. And so now you've really upped the ante in this regard, because now expenses are not what they used to be for our parents. You're playing in a completely different league at this point in terms of how much your children are going to cost you. So in that regard, whereas conservatives used to feel that, you should maintain the nuclear family structure and you should probably have as many children as you could afford, well, that number has drastically reduced. And for a lot of people, especially given in this country how the middle class has decreased, there are not that many people at this point in this country that can afford to send their kids to the schools that would give them the opportunities that you would probably, as a parent, you'd want your children to have. Carter, what do you have to say about that?
No, 100%. So it's not just the school, it's preschool, it's school, and then you still have varsity. And in other countries, I know I like the Isle of Man. I've got a friend there. Preschool is not funded, but school is funded by tax money, so they don't have to save for that. My approach would be is if you're planning to have a child, start saving for their school and varsity, if possible, monthly, small amounts. Throw it into investment. Make a plan. If you have the money to spend, if you've got disposable income for days, that's perfect. You can wing it. But my recommendation is, do build up some form of a war chest for education. It is expensive at the end of the day. And luckily, as you mentioned, there are a few private alternatives. And moving forward, I think we'll see more private schools coming on with that kind of online-centric approach that might bring down the costs. But I think the costs are astronomical. And having some kind of fund that you start before you have children and actually planning for them, that should actually set off that cost. What do you think is the average cost of a child these days? And for the average middle class home, if you raise a child from being an infant to fully grown
18.
adult till 18?
To 18?
Yes.
Oh, holy hell. Oh my, so like everything, you're talking living expenses.
Yes, yeah, school, everything.
Oh, holy hell. I don't know.
Average middle class. It's in the region of 1.68 million. So let's make it a smooth even 1.7.
Yeah, I was gonna guess.
Per child. It's about 256 Rand a day and 785 per month. 7,785. Sorry, Freudian Zuma slip there. So that's the average cost. So not and again, let me do a disclaimer here because I can see this rock getting thrown to my face. I'm not saying children are not worth it because of monetary value. It's just a statistic, and it's just a value to kind of say, okay, it's probably a good idea to save a bit because children are expensive. So I think all the parents in this chat will actually agree in that it's not cheap having children, and I think they get very creative. I know Gentle, for instance, she likes growing her own food, which is a great way to offset some costs. Also teach the children to get busy in the garden. Make them slaves work for their dinner. Love it, Gentle. But it's a good way to get them interested in being a bit more self-sufficient as well. So
yeah, and also again, I suppose it's just a commentary on given the way the middle class is at this point. There's only so many kids now. Maybe in the past you could have had 4 children. Now it's going to mean you can only have 2 kids.
Exactly.
And so it's going to have serious implications for your childbearing decisions. And that's kind of the point, is that just to kind of say, it's not the way it used to be. So even though you might be conservative and you might think, yes, I want to maintain the nuclear structure, there's certain realities that have kicked in the modern world that are just going to mean you can't do it in the same way.
And also remember, on average, populations that are better educated have fewer children, right? If you look at even the Chinese and Japan's populations, and even in America, they're going down. Like they're not having as many children. So like you say, it's prohibitively expensive. And and I think the biggest freedom women ever got was like when they started, when you could control whether you want children or not. And I think that was a big freedom because you put the power in your guys' hands. So we are.
And I think in that respect, it's just a responsible thing to say, look, I can only afford so many children, so that's the number of children I'm going to have.
Right.
I mean, sometimes, yes, accidents happen, and then you have a choice to make, and that's life, and shit happens.
And then sometimes the parents tell that said child, you're the mistake. Also, Freudian slip from the parents.
Oh, boy,
I know a few people, they know it.
No, I know that
it's a bit awkward for a few years, but hopefully they'll work through it. If the parents are half decent, they'll bribe the child into submission or do something good to them, and I don't know, buy them over.
I mean, another reason to have children, I've heard people give this reason as well, is that they say, well, look, presumably you have a certain set of values, and presumably you think that your set of values are values that need to be perpetuated in the world because you think that that's what leads to a good society. And so you think to yourself, well, I want to perpetuate this set of values. How do I do that? And one way of doing that, presumably, is that you could have children and you could teach them those values, and then that's how you would perpetuate them in the world. But I mean, one thing that I've noticed, and I think most people have said this, it's that sort of thing where people say, yeah, when you're young, you're a liberal or you're very left-leaning. And then as you get older, you become more right-leaning because you grow up and you realize, that's not really how the world works. But that is actually very indicative of how it actually does happen a lot of the time, because children, as they grow up, it's not necessarily the case that they're going to have their parents' values. In fact, it's probably much more likely that they're not going to have their parents' values, at first at least, because we tend to be rebellious when we're young. We think we see everything our parents do wrong. So we tend to kind of, lash out at that and go, yeah, I'm not going to be like that. I'm not going to do that.
Right.
And so in that way, there's no guarantee that, your idea of perpetuating your values is in any way going to play itself out. Because I think this is the part, when I've looked at just how my parents raised me and my sister, and when I've looked at how other parents have raised their children, or how I look at how my sister raises her daughter, I think one of the things I've noticed for me is the most important thing about, if you're going to have a child, you have to accept that this person is an individual in their own right. And you can have all the ideas you like about who they're going to be and what they're going to do and how they're going to, engage in your hobbies with you and all this stuff. But they may be very different to you and they may not like any of that. And you have to respect that, because that's the choice you've made. You've chosen to bring an independent, sentient creature into the world. And if you really are going to say that you love who they are, you have to actually get to know who they are, not who you want them to be. And
Right.
in that respect, I think parents can often do a lot of harm to their children, because they try and impose their values rather than sort of just acting by example and letting their children choose that, if that's what their children want to choose. But the point is just that if you want to perpetuate your values, it's not necessarily the case that having kids is going to guarantee that. In fact, might guarantee the opposite.
Right. I actually want to add to this, and then also like play to the other side as well. From a lot of accounts that I've spoken to a lot of people and watched quite a few topics on this. And then having children as well, a lot of people will acknowledge, like, yes, it is hard sometimes, but by God, they become more empathetic with time than they ever were. They become better people because it comes back to that resilience aspect, right? Because the children, it's easier not to have 2 or 3 little dependents running around that you have to feed, you have to care for, you have to put in bed, right? But also the challenge of that, I think, make in some case, if not all, unless you're really like kind of bad person, you become resilient and you build a lot of character, because raising children is no walk in the park. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, I've looked after my brother's child and my sister's children. It's a hell of a job. Keeps you busy. And I can think actually at the end of the day, one of the things that, they and other people have told me a lot, it builds a lot of empathy, being the key quality that they develop. And they just say they feel like they become better people because they had children, because it's, like I said, it's such a challenge. It challenges you every day, and you build patience and you build temperance and you build empathy, and you actually develop quite a few good qualities. And through that, you actually become a better person as well. So again, that's one of the observations that I've made about having children.
I mean, my mom also, my parents weren't going to have kids. And then when my mom hit her 30s, then she realized that if she didn't have children, then she would never be able to have them. So they decided to have kids, and she always says that it was the best decision that she ever made. She can't imagine her life without her children. And I completely believe her. I don't think she's lying at all. And I think, but again, I think in her case, the time at which she was having children also played a role in how, what was going into that decision. Because again, when my parents were having kids, there were certain advantages that they had that it's not obvious that you have now. So maybe if they were living now, they would have only had 1 child instead of 2 children, maybe. I don't know.
Right.
But I just think that the only point I want to make is that when parents think about first of all, I don't think parents think that much about why do they want to have children. But if they do think about it, I think it's just also important to consider the fact that your kid can actually be, and often does turn out to be, not anything you expected. So whatever plans you have for that child in terms of how you think they'll develop and who you think they'll be, I think it's important to consider, what if they're not like that at all? Like, what if they're literally the complete opposite to you? And is that a journey you still want to take? Like you said, because it develops you, because you still want that experience of raising a human being and seeing what they become. And maybe that is, but the point of this show is basically just to get people thinking about it. It's really not to in any way dictate to people what they should or shouldn't do. It's really just to get them thinking about this question. And I think for me, the interest around it is also how it's become very politicized.
So I actually want to answer a question, Dioné, about like my personal decision, because you gave a bit of background on yours. I see 3ZA. My parents had a multi-year, very rough divorce. We were sent to therapists left, right, and center, and we were used as nuclear warheads because they were spiteful against each other, and they tried to spite each other at every turn. And on that, I just decided I'll never want to be in a situation where I put anyone through the same situation. Not saying I'll end up the same way, but it's just I feel like there was a lot of damage that could have been avoided if both parents were just, if they treated that differently. And I just made the conscious choice that I don't feel comfortable with bringing a child into this world and letting them live in a world and get hurt in any which way that I do. So you can call it a cop-out or whatever you like. I just don't want that risk there. And I also don't think maybe that this world is ideal at this stage. Let's say it's not necessarily set 100% in stone. It's just my current sentiment. Other thing is I'm inherently... I like freedom. I like getting in my car and just driving to places, looking up and going, and not being bound to one place. A bit of an adventurous spirit like that. And I'd have to give that up. And maybe I'm a bit too selfish to do that, but I'm honest with myself at the very least about who and what I am. So I acknowledge that before I make any big decisions of having children and still being a selfish prick. So that's kind of a very summarized, condensed version. It's much more complex than that, but due to time, I had to condense it. I hope that's satisfactory.
I think that's actually a good point, because I think that what I was going to say next is that, well, people also have kids because in a lot of ways they are programmed to, right? Their biology programs them, their society programs them. There are a lot of drivers around them all the time that are basically convincing them this is the next step, this is the thing they should be doing, this is what it means to be a grown-up, this is what it means to be part of society, this is what it means to do this. And fine, but you're a rational person, you can override that, right? You don't have to succumb to that. And I think it is a cop-out to imagine that that's something you have to cave to. And I think what you just said is an important part of it. If you do genuinely want it, and that's why I don't like feminists to have a go at women who choose to get married and to have kids and to be housewives. If that's something you've chosen, power to you. And I hope you have a fantastic life.
Right.
Because you chose that. That's something you really actually wanted. It's not something that society, just conned you into thinking was what it meant to be a woman. It's what you, and in this day and age, actually, you are the outlier if you now actually do the conventional thing of getting married and having kids, because there'll be so many feminists who are knocking at your door, ready to rip your head off for the audacity of doing the conventional thing. But I think that if that's what you actually want, that's amazing. Then do what you want to do. But I think the problem comes in when, like you say, you don't know yourself. So you actually haven't reflected on your character and you've gone, actually, would I be good for a child? So do I actually have the character type that would mean that a child has the kind of life that they deserve? And like you said, you're very adventurous. So you would find it very difficult because you actually do want to just be able to pick up and go. And so that's an important part of the consideration is, are you doing this because your parents have told you that that's what you should be doing, or society has told you that, or are you doing it because it's something you actually want? So So
Yeah, I think it's important to note that what we said earlier, like there's that inborn maybe need or desire. I just don't have it. Like and even though I mentioned what I mentioned, I think that is why, or maybe instinctively it was always there. It's very difficult to trace it back, right?
yeah, yeah,
But for me, it's like I'm not nihilistic or anything. I'm actually very happy. I'm happy in a weird way. I'm very happy that all that shit went down, right? Because I had a lot of life lessons that I learned in that decade where my parents had a very, very dirty divorce. It prepared me infinitely more for life. It made me much more resilient, and yeah, bring me adversity any day, and I can handle it now. And so there's an upside to it, but there's also
yeah,
something you do value stability, as you mentioned. You do value, and I think naturally then I err more towards conservatism, right? Because it values the nuclear family, it values that good old fashioned values, and I think that's important.
Okay, so let's move on. If you've got nothing more to say about
Let's
why
go.
one should have kids, let's move on to why one shouldn't have kids. Okay, so the biggest position, and I don't subscribe to this position, but I mean, this is, the main position against it is called antinatalism, and this is by David Benatar, who's the head of philosophy at UCT. And his position is that, in fact, it's morally wrong to have children. He thinks it's morally wrong because what you're doing is you are knowingly bringing a human into being where you know that that human, on average, will suffer more harms than goods. So, in that, given that kind of view of life, that on average there'll be more bad stuff than there will be good stuff, his claim is you shouldn't bring new life into being because essentially you're morally harming that person. So there's a very good conversation. If people are interested, I think I'll put the link below this conversation later. But it's a conversation between Jordan Peterson and David Benatar on what's that show called?
Is it Renegade Report?
Renegade Report. There it is.
Yes,
Renegade.
have
I knew it was something with an R. Renegade Report. And Jordan Peterson debates Benatar because he disagrees with him. He doesn't think that it's morally wrong to bring children into the world. And his main thesis is that, well, even if you acknowledge that on average there are more bad things that are going to happen than good things, Peterson's point is that there are still modes of being according to which those harms can lead to greater good. So it's not basically guaranteed that your child is going to, on average, suffer more harms than goods. It depends on how they are essentially handling those harms. And I think that this is a standard argument throughout philosophy. If you even think about the argument from evil, which is from philosophy of religion, where it's basically like, well, if God is all-knowing, all good, and all-powerful, then why would he allow any bad things to ever befall humans? Because he has the motive, the power, and every kind of tool at his disposal to make it the case that that doesn't happen. So why would he let evil befall humans? And the standard response to that is that, well, because humans can only develop their souls if they face adversity. So the only way you can develop your soul is if you go through hardship. Now, say whatever you want about that argument, that's for another day. But I think Jordan Peterson has a point, which is that if you want some of the best goods you can ever have out of life, for example, things like meaning, you often can't get those things without suffering, because the best things in life that are worth having are not things you can just have without having to undergo some sort of psychological development. So if you think of like knowledge is something that it's painful to get, but it's a massive good thing to have. It's like it's incredibly rewarding to get this thing. Or if you think of just your psychological development over time when you mature, you have to go through a lot of crap things, but there are a lot of net benefits that result as a consequence. So Benatar's view is that even so, the bad things are still going to outweigh the good things, and Peterson's point is that that's not necessarily the case. It depends on the individual at hand. And so you can't know that beforehand. So that means you can't just not have children, because your child may actually be the child that can overcome that and have all of those good things.
Right.
Do you want to? Yeah.
Just a few comments. I keep an eye on these. Yes, Dioné is a avid. She's got pets, 2 cats and a dog, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not allowed to have pets. I'm not allowed to have nice things where I stay, unfortunately, gentle. And I just want to touch on a comment by Eleutheria, which is a valid point. There are families that have traveling lifestyles, no longer bound by institutionalized education. So, right, if your kids have a remote studying regime and you can generate income while remote, 100% agree. I mean, it's not as rigid anymore. So taking that into consideration as well. So it's a good, valid point, for sure. Just wanted to add that part. Go on.
No, I wanted to know what you think of Peterson's response to the antinatalism argument.
Look, funny enough, I could be actually on Benatar's side, right? Went through a lot of shit. It did a very heavy lifting. Could have been nihilistic. Could have been jaded. And maybe for big periods of my life I was. And then what that did is I became completely hedonistic, right? So all I wanted was pleasure, but none of the pain. Because it was just a veil. It was just a cover-up. It was just a way to move forward without any consequences. And then one day you wake up and then you feel all the pain and all the nihilism and everything at that moment because you're like, shit, what have I done? And then you have to actually get to grips with it and start working through that all. Because you've been living in this dream that you've created, but actually it's the worst nightmare ever. Because you've just been living this this hedonistic lifestyle, which is the absolute pursuit of pleasure. And you don't dwell on things that make you sad or anything. You just move forward and you just go for what's fun. You don't care about purpose, right? Because it's all about the pleasure. And then you hit that rock wall one day and you're like, shit, I can't move forward anymore. What am I doing? Why am I doing it? And then introspection starts. But it's also like having the worst hangover of your life, because then all of a sudden the brick wall comes down and it falls right on your face and you're like, shit, here we go. I have to deal with everything that I've done, everything that I've said, everyone that I've ever hurt in the cycle of just jawling and having a great time. And now you have to like work through all of this. And then it's your trauma and everything. And then you have to confront it all and move forward. So technically I should be on Benatar's side, but I side with Peterson on that. Because again, overcoming that and building resilience has probably been the best thing that I've ever done in my life. Eventually, but it took a lot. It wasn't easy. I was depressed for a few years as well when I worked through it. It did come at a hell of a cost, but at the end of the day, like I say, like throw me with anything now and I'll just kind of shrug it off. So it does pay off. Depends from person to person, right? Some people will overcome it and some people will completely crumble and they won't ever be the same again.
And that's an interesting question because, when you hit that, I mean, look, I haven't done what you've done. I haven't ever pursued that sort of hedonistic agenda. But obviously I've been through my own share of crap and I've been through times where I've kind of like questioned the meaning of life and where I'm going and why and all of this kind of thing. And it seems that there's always this point at which you can tip one way or the other where you can basically succumb, or you can that fighting instinct can kick in and you can gradually, not necessarily overnight, but you can gradually think of ways to kind of pivot out of it and to eventually kind of find some sort of stability, or at least something that you can aim at until you find that stability. And it's not, and they still don't really understand what that is, that ability for some people to pivot out of it and other people to basically succumb. It's actually quite fascinating. Psychologists still don't understand exactly why some people can do it and some other people can't do it.
Right.
And so, but that's exactly why it's not enough to say you shouldn't have kids, because how do you know that your child is not going to be the kind of person who can pivot out of that and can actually use those challenges as a stepping stone to achieve great things and become like great figures in history, or just not even something as glamorous. Just be very happy in their lives. You don't know that.
Not another mediocre white person at the very
Yeah.
least.
But even so, I mean, like in my opinion, if you're mediocre but you're very happy, in my opinion, that's not actually being mediocre. That's actually like achieving something very few people do.
Right.
So that's not, I've never been someone who's thought that, to be something in the world, you have to have achieved great things. I think if you are someone who can achieve happiness in whatever space you are, that's pretty fucking amazing. I don't, I fucking envy that. That's incredible.
Right. I just
So
want to move
yeah.
this along a bit because I see we might run out of time.
No, we're still good. We're still good. So the other thing that's come up with the political dimension to now the not having kids thing, which has sort of come up in recent years, which is part of this antinatalism movement, is people on the left who have very deep, so sort of the Greta Thunbergs of the world, who have very deep concerns about the environmental state of the planet. And so they've come up as a new movement where they're against having kids. So they've basically vowed to not have children because
they use a sustainability debate.
So their belief is that the world can't handle any more people, so it's overpopulated. We're going to run out of resources. Some of them are basically just in a position of the world's in such a dire state because of climate change that they're essentially like, it would now be, so it's not even Benatar's argument. It's, in some sense it is, but it's basically more motivated by left-leaning policies. So it's that it would now be a moral wrong to bring children into a world where these existential threats are looming.
That's quoting the Thanos argument.
Okay.
I still need to watch it.
What? Ish. Okay.
Beat me up later. It's fine. Continue.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know what you think of that. I mean, those claims around basically the environmental conditions of the world are...
Yeah, the evidence doesn't substantiate that. It's not accurate at all. A lot of the claimants that the extreme environmentalists make are not true, but it's become like a cult, very much like the leftists. It's become part of the whole thing, right? Let's do sustainability. Let's do solar panels everywhere. But by God, California already said let's go green, and already they've got ESCOM 2.0. They've got rolling blackouts because there's not enough power. So there's a lot of fallacies with what they say. They are actually I just think it's completely. I think the whole thing between the meat argument that animals create so much carbon versus people that want to create synthetic meat, I think it's wholly unsubstantiated, and I think it's a big vegan movement, but that I'll have that discussion on another evening. But it's those very same people, the globalists, that say like the world is in so much peril. It's the very same people. If you look at the money, it's them pushing for that no more cattle vibe. Everything should be. It's the vegans that are pushing for no more cattle. So it's there's a lot of here to uncover, and that could actually make a very interesting episode. So
yeah, no, it should probably be a separate one, right? Because we'd have to go through all the scientific evidence and sort of like actually give it its due. I know a lot of people.
I just want to agree with wholeheartedly with Joe, and that it tastes terrible, and the texture is off, and no, be a real man or a real woman and eat real meat. That's all I'm saying.
Look, I mean, like also I know people who have their concerns about climate change and the consequences of it. I also know, for example, that Jordan Peterson has made the claim that essentially in terms of overpopulation, there is an upper limit to where we will go, and it's not clear that at that upper limit we can't sustain life. So it's not guaranteed that those, whatever they think is going to happen is going to mean that you can't have more kids, because it's going to become it's going to essentially be the breaking point for this planet.
Right. It's the same with that equality argument, right? We all want to be, some people say we all want to be equal, but what does that look like? We don't know how to make people equal. We don't know how to remove the haves versus the have-nots and make that gap closer. The only thing we know what does it is natural disasters, famine, and war. These are the great equalizers. If you want equality, you want everyone to stack up from zero, that is the way. But we haven't found a viable way. And the only way that we found, the only thing that uplifts millions and billions of people is capitalism. That's uplift people off from abject poverty. I think Gentle made a comment earlier where she actually said, like, you get some very poor people and then someone becomes a doctor, right? What happens then with that family? So you're not even middle class. So you get someone going into the middle class for the first time. It's the first time probably that person generates generational wealth. But to have generational wealth, you need children or someone in the family to have children to pass it on to, or else. And then with that generational wealth, it becomes a cycle, right? Because everyone moving forward will have some generational wealth. And that's how you uplift people from poverty. So you have to ask yourself, if you have a lot of nice things, who are you passing it on to? Like, is it other people in the family's children? Is it your own children? Is that the beginning of generational wealth? And that, according to me, in capitalism is one of the core tenets. That's how you uplift a generation or two from now, from being in a very lower class income bracket to being middle class or higher.
Yeah.
So just an interesting, non-related thing to consider as well.
Yeah. And then the other things we considered was, I mean, we've kind of already considered, it was that maybe you aren't suited to having children, which is kind of something we did already touch on, this idea of self-reflection. So maybe it has nothing to do with where the planet's at or antinatalism or anything like that, but maybe you as a person are not suited to having children. And I think it would be a complete lie to suggest that every person is suited to having children, because some people are absolutely not suited to having children. Like if you're someone who's like, and that's all, I mean, like I have a lot of reasons why I don't want children. Some of my reasons are basically that I don't think I would be a very good mother, in the sense that I think I would be so overprotective of my kids that it would essentially be bad for them. Like I would become that kind of neurotic mother that's like, I don't ever want anything bad to happen to you guys, so I'm going to stunt your growth so that I know that you guys are safe. And for me,
but then you need the counterbalance. Yeah, but the counterbalance of that would be having a non-neurotic partner, right? So when you are being very neurotic, your other partner's like, sick, calm here, calm down. Everything will be okay.
No, sure. That's the, but then I go, would I ever trust someone enough to have a child with them? Because then I know that they'll be in my life forever, whether I want them to be or not, because now I share a child with them. And for me, I have massive trust issues. So I'm like, oh, hell no, I don't trust. I'm never going to trust someone enough to fucking share that something that important with them and go, like, I actually trust you enough to share a human being with you. Because, like, right. I've seen that, and you've seen that go wrong so many times, where you think someone is something, and then they're suddenly not that, and you're like, fuck, now I have a kid with them, and now I have to have them in my life forever.
All I can say about that is, like, make sure your pull-out game is strong, all the men out there.
Exactly.
And right. Also contraceptives, always contraceptives.
Yeah. Look, I mean, at the end of the day,
models.
like, yeah, but look, I mean, come on, sometimes shit happens. Like, you can't be
I saw the 1% there from Gentle earlier. That 1%.
Of course, but it does. And I'm obviously, in those cases, obviously, we're not talking about cases like that. Obviously, I acknowledge that, yes, there are going to be times when it happens. And then you're going to have to make a decision. And you're going to have to, either decide to be a parent or to not be a parent. But you're going to have to decide to do the best you can do. But, right. I mean, we're not really talking about cases like that. And then you and I also discussed, like, another reason for not having kids is to consider, do you have the financial means? And this is just practical. Do you have the ability to have them? And have you actually gone through what it would cost you to have them?
Right.
And I think people, like you said, they underestimate what that looks like, because they don't often take into account all the aspects of what it means to have a child.
No, I mean, I think it's a bit different. I mean, if you go, we've got 10 minutes left. In some countries, your tax actually covers your medical. It covers some of your school. It covers a lot of things, right?
Yeah.
South Africa, you get taxed, one of the 8th highest tax country in the world. Plus, you have to pay for all of these things separately, because in some cases, you can't rely on public infrastructure, right? I'd rather go to a butcher shop than a public hospital. to get amputated, I'll be more comfortable with that. So
Probably, yeah.
yeah, so expenses and resource management is key, as we mentioned earlier. It can become inhibitively expensive at the end of the day if you don't plan properly. So yeah, that's my 5 cents. I think
All
we've
right.
covered that a bit
Any
earlier.
questions? Are there any questions here you'd like to tackle?
Yeah, I think we need to unwind here.
Okay.
We can still go along lightly. I just see Ice ZA said I beat him to it. I don't know what I beat him to. Oh, Gentle, good point. So many people cannot have kids. And by God, I've seen this. And these are most of them I've met are the most deserving. They are the best people. I've got an Indian couple here in the building that I stay at. They couldn't have kids. I think the lady spent something close to almost 150 or so thousand rand trying to.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, for years, and she couldn't, and they never adopted, which is kind of strange. I don't know. Like someone earlier mentioned, there is that
Yes.
need we sometimes said to like pass on your own genes, and
Yeah,
they won't
yeah.
adopt. So probably something like that. But they resigned themselves to international travel, and they've lived their best lives, and they've got so many stories to tell, and they're really a good couple. And yeah, so I'm seeing them tomorrow night, probably for more stories and entertainment.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would also say, like, if I ever did, like you said earlier, like, you know, it's how you feel right now. Maybe you'll change your mind. I'm also open to changing my mind. I doubt it will happen, but I also think if it does happen, a part of me goes, I think I'm more likely to want to adopt a child than to want to have one. And it's mainly because I think that if there are children out there, I mean, it's not for everyone, and I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just saying that every person, like, you have to make decisions that are right for you as a person, and it's not the same for everyone. But I think that for me, the thought of adopting a child makes me a lot more comfortable than trying to fall pregnant and, you know, trying to push for that.
Yeah. So back to a real issue, Dioné. When I was a child, my dad was on man duty and my mom was away. And I think he just had, for some odd reason, he only had one nappy the day, and it was winter. And I obviously had a number 2 in the nappy, the Yilling biscuit. And my dad took me out in the winter. He tried to change it, and he's like, my dad is a staunch Afrikaner man. He's van, ach nee, foxies. And he legit walked out. He took me on my feet, took the cold water, and he just like rinsed my asshole off. And I was walking without pants for the whole day. My mom got home and she's like, where's his nappy? And he's like, ach nee man, I did vol gekak. And then I was just walking like cold the whole day. I just didn't give a fuck. So yeah, just a lighthearted story about that. That's probably me changing a nappy every time. I'm very squeamish. And I've got a gag reflex like it's no one's business. I'd be a terrible woman in that regard.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was thinking. Holy hell.
Yeah, but can I go to a gripe that I have? And this is something very close to my heart, and I think a lot of people on this thing as well. Social grants, where I as a taxpayer have to fund other people that can't have children, but should not have children because they can't afford it. But I am funding it. And most of these children are not being raised in environments that are conducive. Most of them, I think, what was it? A third of them never met their fathers. I think that was
way higher. It's over 60%.
Higher.
So, right. And then they're likely, because they don't have fathers, just to give people a perspective, they're more likely to be aggressive, more likely to be depressed, more likely to have low self-esteem, more likely to do poorly in schools, more likely to be incarcerated and to commit suicide, more likely to use drugs. So if you ever think that the consequence of having a kid under unfavorable circumstances isn't high, it's incredibly high. Like, if you make that mistake and your kid is not, like, you know, raised in that nuclear family, and look, you know, it's not, because you can still have families that are not like the parents are married. That's fine. But if the child still has 2 parents who love them and they still actually have relationships with those 2 parents, cool. But for most kids in this country, they don't even know who their fathers are. So it's not like that. And in those cases, there are serious psychological consequences. And then we wonder why we're in the mess that we're in.
Yeah. In closing, I think there was another point that I just wanted to make before we close this down. Important one. In some cases,
Hang
one
on,
parent.
sorry, sorry, Carter, I just have to address this. Like, it's really bugging me now. You people who keep saying like, oh yeah, we should have a parent or two. I have to say though, it's strange to me that you think that two people who haven't had kids, because we haven't had kids, but we know people who have kids and we actually intimately, they're part of our lives. We can't have rational conversations around having kids and considering the pros and cons for and against having kids when we have very close relationships with people who do have children. I think that's very strange because it's essentially the same argument that the left uses when they go, yes, you don't have the lived experience, so you can't comment on this. So, seriously, come on. Yes, we can have a rational conversation about this. And I don't think Carter and I have done a disservice to any person who has a child and has like given their reasons for why they have children. And I'm very close to my sister and very close to my niece. So really, give me a break. Okay, go Carter.
Oh, I was going to just take it one step back. Sorry. Look, at the end of the day, this is a discussion about how we perceive it, and obviously there will be gaps, right? And there will be like you say, there will be lived experience from parents at the end of the day in this discussion, and I think I've been quite amicable to kind of bring all the conversations, all the comments from this side in, and I mean, if it's your wish, I mean, you're more than welcome to have this discussion again with the parent, but I think at the end of the day, we gave our perspectives, like you mentioned, from what we've experienced, and we tried to bring in the audience as much as we could. So to each their own, I'd say. This is the fun. This is what freedom gets you, right? Everyone can have a conversation on this. You don't always have to agree, but just keep it amicable. That's what I'd say.
No, it's just that I honestly feel like at this point, like, you can always have a rational conversation about it and consider other perspectives. It's not necessary that you need to have lived it yourself. Of course, yes, like you say, there's certain experiences that you wouldn't have had. But I also think that given where you and I come from, where we have people in our lives who have kids and they've given us very good reasons why they've had them and why they love them. Honestly, I don't really see what, given that we've had the input from the audience as well, I don't see what that would have added that would have basically been so revolutionary to this conversation that it would have completely changed the game. Really don't see that, but maybe I'm wrong.
I'm just looking at a fun comment, and it's like I got taken to the cleaners, and I was like, my dad twice. Once within, what was it, communion of property, and secondly, my dad didn't sign anything, and he still got taken to the cleaners. I'm like, you poor bastard, like, yeah, and that's the whole discussion for another day. But yeah, he got cleaned out twice, but I always came back stronger. So kudos to that tough bastard.
Anyway, thank you so much for joining me, Carter. I think it's been a really cool conversation. And yeah, like let's try and have it again with parents, because apparently that would change the nature of this conversation.
Could be interesting. I'd love to see the outcome of that. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Have a great evening.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in. Have a good evening. Cheers.